And even in Russia today, the scale of the problem has been officially recognized and a state of emergency has been declared in the fuel sector. Right now in Russia, damage has been recorded at 80% of the country's largest oil refineries, and attacks by Ukrainian drones are continuing. As a result, the volume of oil processing at Russian refineries in May fell to its lowest level in the past 17 years. After a series of drone raids, which last month managed to hit 8 out of the 10 largest oil refineries in Russia, the Kremlin even declared a unilateral one-day ceasefire in this war, but it didn't work. Already today, a gasoline shortage has been declared across Russia, and any fuel exports have been banned. In some regions, there is no gasoline at gas stations at all. At the same time, the fight against the shadow fleet of the Russian Federation has intensified in Europe. Today, France detained another Russian tanker. Against this backdrop, it became known that US President Donald Trump personally called on President Xi Jinping to help end the war in Ukraine and admitted that the US cannot handle this situation alone. So let's bring all these topics together and talk. Let's discuss them. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this together. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment you want. And friends, if you want to listen to these episodes only in Ukrainian, I now have a Ukrainian language YouTube channel. The link to it is in the description of this video. Go ahead, subscribe, I'll be glad to see you there as well. So, let me briefly start with the news that US President Donald Trump is asking Chinese leader Xi Jinping to help end the war in Ukraine. This information was reported today by the South China Morning Post, but notably, shortly after publication, the outlet deleted the article without explanation. According to the outlet's sources, during the summit in Beijing in May, Donald Trump told Xi Jinping that negotiations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation had reached a deadlock, and he strongly urged him to bring the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin back to the negotiating table with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The publication's sources noted that Trump's appeal reflected a clear need for the US to involve China in its efforts to end the war. According to them, the US president made resolving the war in Ukraine his main foreign policy goal after returning to the White House in 2025. The publication recalled that negotiations between Ukraine and Russia largely reached a deadlock after their direct talks in Istanbul in July 2025 ended without reaching a ceasefire agreement. Soon after that, Trump began to put pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky, urging him to reach an agreement with the Russians. But now it has become clear that Trump was obviously putting pressure on the wrong person, and that's why he is now asking Xi Jinping to finally put pressure on Vladimir Putin. But against this backdrop, the strongest pressure on Putin is being applied by the armed forces of Ukraine. Last night, Ukrainian forces carried out another strike on the Saratov oil refinery. This attack is part of a global trend. In May, Ukraine carried out at least 16 attacks on Russian fuel production facilities. Against the backdrop of processing volumes falling to their lowest level in the past 17 years, Russian authorities are trying to avoid shortages and a sharp rise in prices within Russia. And now the Kremlin is already prepared to resort to unpopular measures. It is reported that oil processing volumes at Russian refineries in May fell to a 17-year low after a series of drone strikes over the past month that hit 8 out of the 10 largest oil refineries in Russia. The refinery utilization rate compared to the pre-war year of 2021 dropped by about 20% and became the lowest since October 2009. In May, the Ukrainian armed forces carried out 16 drone strikes on oil refineries, 7 attacks on oil pipelines, 6 on ports, and 1 on a tanker at sea. The total number of attacks on oil refineries and oil infrastructure, of which there are just over 30, has become unprecedented since the start of the war and has exceeded the previous record set in December. At that time, 26 oil facilities were hit, including 15 refineries. But importantly, the tactics of the Ukrainian strikes have also changed. Now, the armed forces of Ukraine are attacking not only primary oil processing units, but also secondary units. As it turned out, these are the very units that help refineries produce more gasoline and diesel fuel. and they are much more difficult and expensive to repair. And now, faced with a drop in production, oil companies have sharply reduced the supply of gasoline to the exchange, where small private gas stations purchase their fuel. So in May, the supply of 95-octane gasoline dropped by a third. As gasoline becomes scarcer on the market, its prices go up. And so, on the wholesale market, since the beginning of the year, gasoline prices inside Russia have jumped by 26%. Let me repeat, Russia is the country that exports huge volumes of oil. So there, gasoline prices have gone up, and in retail, as you can imagine, gasoline is getting more expensive much faster, even than inflation is rising. And now the most amusing situation is currently in the occupied Crimea. There, fuel is already being sold through ration coupons because of attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine on the highway which Russians call the Novorossiya Highway. It's a key artery, the land corridor to the peninsula. I had a detailed analysis about this in a separate episode, so be sure to go to the channel and watch it. And now, local telegram channels in Crimea are already reporting today that gas stations can't keep up. And online there are offers to buy gasoline for 300 to 350 rubles per liter. On the Avito platform, users are selling cans of gasoline for 300 to 350 rubles per liter, since most gas stations across Crimea are simply closed. And these ads appeared after the so-called head of Crimea appointed by the Russians, Sergei Aksyonov, announced that AI-95 gasoline would only be sold with coupons and with strict limits per person. It is reported that against the backdrop of the fuel crisis, Russians have started to cancel their bookings for tourist trips to Crimea. The Russian Union of the Tourism Industry has recommended that tourists traveling to the peninsula on their own by personal vehicle should have their own supply of gasoline and take into account the rules for transporting it across the Crimean Bridge. In short, they're being told directly that if you're going, keep in mind there's no gasoline in Crimea, so stock up, put it in your trunk instead of, I don't know, beach gear. It's better to put a canister of gasoline in your car, otherwise you simply won't be able to leave Crimea later. Well, the thing is, since the end of March, gasoline exports from Russia have already been banned. Since June, the export of jet fuel has also been banned, which means there's not even enough gasoline for the domestic Russian market. Automotive fuel shortages have now reached the capital region of the Russian Federation. And now in New Moscow, gas stations have started putting up notices limiting gasoline sales to 60 liters per person. Experts remind us that rising fuel prices have previously even sparked protests in Russia. In particular, this happened in 2018, but nevertheless, it also contributed to inflation. To protect local supplies, the Kremlin banned any fuel exports, but it is expected that oil refining volumes in Russia will decrease even further due to plant shutdowns and reduced operations. According to estimates by the analytical company Oil OLX, the average figure in May should reach just over 4.5 million barrels per day, which is about 700,000 barrels per day less than a year earlier. Well, and the problem for Russians is really huge. It has gotten to the point that we missed another truce. Yes, the assistant to the Russian dictator Yuri Ushakov stated that apparently Russia supposedly did not strike Kiev this weekend because they decided to declare a truce for Trinity Sunday. Supposedly, Putin proposed a one-day truce for Trinity Sunday, during which he refused to give the order for a massive missile strike and expected that Ukraine would also not attack oil refineries across Russia. But it didn't work, because no one takes the Russians at their word anymore. So yes, if you missed it, apparently we had another truce. And against this backdrop, unpleasant sentiments for Vladimir Putin have started to spread in Russia. The Russian dictator is planning to hold the 5th meeting in St. Petersburg dedicated to Russia's military economy. The meeting will take place against the backdrop of Russian authorities trying to find ways to spur economic growth, while Ukrainian drone strikes are damaging the Russian economy and businesses see no end to the war. And now Reuters reports that the Russian economy, which largely depends on raw materials, is estimated at about $3 trillion. Has sharply slowed its growth rate. If in 2024 the Russian economy grew by almost 5% year on year, then last year this figure was less than 1%. But that's not all. In the first quarter of 2026, the Russian economy shrank by 0.2%. And by the end of this year, even the Kremlin is optimistically expecting economic growth by as much as 0.4%. And here I'll quote Reuters. Previously, there were warnings in Russian elite circles that the war could seriously hurt the Russian economy. At the same time, Kirill Dmitriev, who is involved in contacts with Donald Trump's team, noted the possible economic benefits of a peace agreement, which was never signed. However, one of the high-ranking Russian bankers said that Vladimir Putin had a great chance to make a peace deal last year, but he missed it. And against this backdrop, Europe continues to hunt down the Russian shadow fleet that helps Vladimir Putin sell oil. On Sunday, French Navy sailors detained the sanctioned oil tanker Tagor in the Atlantic Ocean by boarding the vessel. This was reported by French President Emmanuel Macron. He stated that the vessel was coming from the Russian port of Murmansk. Moscow considers France's detention of the oil tanker connected to Russia to be illegal. But Emmanuel Macron responded to this, quote, "The operation was carried out in the Atlantic Ocean, in open waters, with the support of several partners, including the United Kingdom, in strict accordance with international maritime law." Just think about that. The Russians are sending out completely illegal shadow fleet tankers, which, by the way, Putin once distanced himself from. Now they admit that they are theirs. These tankers are sailing under a false flag. These tankers are doing everything they can to circumvent international law. And when they are detained, the Russians have the audacity to open their filthy, foul mouths and say that detaining such a tanker is illegal. Well, that's just absurd. Overall, let me remind you that back in March, the authorities of France and the United Kingdom stated that they would not allow tankers connected to the sanctioned Russian shadow fleet to pass through their territorial waters. This greatly complicates Russia's oil trade, which means it harms the Russian economy, and that's a good thing. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. Thank you. Also, subscribe to my exclusively Ukrainian language YouTube channel. This is Alexei Peachy's new channel. Pechi, if you want to get news in Ukrainian, the link is in the description. Be sure to subscribe. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.